Innovator Founder Visa. Namaste and hello everyone. My name is Shivika and welcome to another episode on Careers Beyond Degree. As an immigrant startup founder in the UK, I wish someone did this a few years ago for me. But having been on this journey for the last few years, I'm glad that I'm able to give back to the community by doing this podcast. In today's episode, I'm in conversation with Innovator International, one of the endorsing bodies for the Innovator Founder visa. I'm fully aware that there are so many aspiring founders and business owners across the world who want to start a business in the UK but not sure where to start. I know there's a lot of information available online, but sometimes it's the details, the nitty-gritties of the process that we really want to learn more about. But I promise you that this podcast covers all of that, all your questions, all your doubts about funding, about the process, about what happens after the endorsement. It's got it all. But before you get your tea and coffee to watch this podcast, I would like to extend a big thank you to Innovator International and Keith Atkins for joining me on Careers Beyond Degree. Your time, insights, and everything that you shared about the Innovator Founder route is absolutely invaluable to the community. So thank you so much once again for doing this. Hi, Keith. Welcome to Careers Beyond Degree. It's a pleasure to have you. First and foremost, I would like to thank you and the Innovator International for doing this and for joining me on this podcast. I know there are so many aspiring founders who have been finding answers to a lot of questions, and I'm sure we'll be able to answer all those questions through this podcast. But before we get into the details of the Innovator Founder route, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Shiv. Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks for asking me. My name's Keith Atkins. I'm one of the business assessors for Innovator International. So basically, my role is mainly to look at business plans when they come in and applications, and just to assess them and see how suitable they are for this visa route. So great.
Great. Before we get into the bigger questions about the route, let's start with the basics. What is the Innovator Founder route? Who is it for and who can apply?
Right, yeah, that's really key. Essentially, it's for anybody, as long as you're over 18, who has a innovative idea for a business. It has to be something that's new. And we'll get into the specific criteria. It also needs to be viable and scalable, but essentially it needs to be a new idea for a business that you believe would work well in the United Kingdom. And you also need to be able to sustain yourself during the time that you're developing the business. So it needs to have sort of inbuilt viability, or you need some method by which you can fund, the start of the business. But basically, that's it. So yeah, it's pretty broad. But anyone who has a suitable idea is welcome to apply.
When you say new idea, suitable idea, innovative idea, what does it mean for the endorsing body? What is innovation, scalability, and viability for the endorsing body?
Absolutely. Well, that's the sort of crux of the matter, and obviously that's a major part of what I do, is decide whether any particular application hits those three things. It needs to be innovative, viable, and scalable. So the innovation, there are so many different ideas of what innovation can be. So I can't give you a definitive, it means this. But what it can mean is that somebody has come up with an entirely new process or an entirely new solution the market has never seen. Now, obviously, that's quite rare because, the nature of things, that an awful lot of stuff has already happened in some shape or form. So innovation can be that it's something that already exists but done in a better way or a more efficient way or a cheaper way, or that there's just perhaps an innovation from a different sector could be applied to a new area to really sort of enhance the way things are done. So there are lots of different ways to think of it. But what it can't be is something that clearly is available very widely and already exists. And I don't like to give examples because you can always think of an innovative approach to an existing familiar situation. But for example, if somebody did just want to open a restaurant and there was nothing innovative about how they ran the restaurant, there wasn't any sort of inherently new technology or approach to creating meals or whatever it might be, it'd be hard to see how that could be innovative. and so it has to have something genuinely new and different. Okay, something that's distinct. I think what we need to avoid is somebody saying, for example, they might say, we're the only restaurant in this particular area that serves this particular type of food and only does drinks in a certain way, and we only open on a Wednesday. Because none of those things are really adding anything of value. That's just all you're doing there is making yourself different by restricting yourself in lots of ways. It's not really adding any additional value. So I think that the kind of inherent idea behind this, I think the government are looking for people who can come to the country with a really new approach to doing something that has genuine scope to become viable and scalable. We'll talk about that in a moment. And that hasn't been seen before. So that's the key thing. Now, viability is just that you have the funds and the resources and a credible plan to be able to get this up and running and for it to become successful. That's what we mean by it being viable. And it also needs to be able to sustain the entrepreneur, and give you a wage and a life. And, it can't just be a side hustle or a hobby. It's got to be a genuinely real business. And then scalable is just that obviously the government's looking for things that have the opportunity to grow. So it might start in a particular area of the country. Perhaps that's where you're thinking of basing the company. But often scalability means it can be grown relatively easily, and perhaps to a wider area of the country, possibly even across the whole nation. And also, there's potential international scaling element to this. And one of the criteria to decide whether someone has indefinite leave to remain is around export revenue. So that's part of it as well, because obviously the government would like to create businesses that are outward reaching and that can increase the amount of economic activity we do to service the rest of the world. So that, in a nutshell, those are the three core areas.
When it comes to innovation, there's something mentioned on the Innovator International website as well, that the product or the service should be something that cannot be easily replicated. What does that mean? Like, how close can you get to a competitor, and what really differentiates you then from your competitor?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I hope I don't frustrate people by saying that it varies, because none of these, unfortunately, I can't give absolute definitive answers. And there's a reason for that, because this couldn't just be a tick list. Ultimately, when we assess something, it's the combination of all the factors that matter. And we're really thinking about, the individual founder and what they bring, the potential for the innovation, and the likelihood of the company achieving and getting scale. But you're absolutely right. Having genuine barriers to replication is important. Now, the most obvious is a patent application. So if you create a brand new technology or process that's never been seen before, and if you're able to obtain a patent, now you don't need to have done that before you put this together. And often, unless you've run a company doing a similar thing elsewhere in the world, you might not be at that stage where you're able to do that. But people often apply to us when they've perhaps done some preliminary searches to see if other things already exist. And so that's one way to go about getting protection, but it's not the only way. Obviously, having deep sector knowledge, particularly if you're an acknowledged expert in an area, or you've got a real strong academic background, that can give a degree of defensibility for your business. Although obviously there are also other people perhaps have done the same degree or postgraduate course, so you have to consider that. But often, really, it's, are you able to create an advantage for yourself where it would be hard for other people to copy you? And that could be because perhaps the business you're coming up with has a process in it where you will have access to specialized data that other people wouldn't have access to. So you've already got an advantage there inbuilt in what you're doing. So that's one way, for example. And it could just be, that you've come up with a new process, or your knowledge and your say it's a tech product, the algorithm you're going to produce is so complex, it would be really hard for somebody to reverse engineer that simply, or they'd need to do lots more research to get to where you're already at. So there are lots of different ways. No one of them is, sort of better than another. But those are the kind of things we're looking for. So things that would make your innovation stand out and be different from what other people are doing, but also make it hard for them to copy what you're doing. That's the kind of thing we're looking at here.
Would somebody's personal experience count in this?
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely does. Yeah. And we often find, because part of this is about the credibility of the founder, and often, some of the best innovations we have arise directly out of personal experience. So somebody experienced perhaps a very challenging situation, or identified that something was really difficult to do, and so that led to, well, wouldn't it be good if, those sorts of questions. So that's it's a really good point, actually. So it is as much about the individual and their experience, and particularly any sort of expertise or time they've spent already looking into this. We'll come on to this, I'm sure, but one of the other things that people can do to make their application more credible is to do plenty of genuine research into the market for their innovation. Now, there are sort of three things broadly. Is it all right to talk about this now? Or now it's on
absolutely.
Yeah,
yes,
perfect.
Yeah.
So there are three parts to that. The first is what we'd call sort of desk-based research, and that's around what you'd expect, really, that somebody has researched the market, they're aware of that sector, they understand the problems that people experience, they know the latest trends, the way things are moving, perhaps the size of the market, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of desk-based research. But on top of that, what we really like to see is really detailed competitor research. And this is one area where people do go a bit wrong. And often what people do is they provide a grid which lists perhaps the name of their offer and three or four others next to it, and it'll have perhaps 5 different criteria, and then a tick box grid, so that you can see. And normally it shows that the innovators proposal has all green ticks and the others have lots of crosses. Now, that's fine, but what that is really is a little bit of obvious advertising, and what we really want to see is a genuinely kind of nuanced and honest reflection of the relative strengths. You don't have to be amazing compared to all the others, but you do need to show that you've got areas of differentiation and you've got genuine advantages. So it might be that some of your competitors have ticks where you don't, because that's a more honest evaluation. But what you do need to show is that you've got some important areas where your solution is advantageous, and therefore there's a reason why people would choose it. And then that leads us on to the third type of research, which in some ways can be the most important. But it depends on what you're producing, and also depends how far down the line you are to creating it. And that is direct customer research. So when you've actually gone to the market, not just looked online to see what research says, that's important to get that sort of, secondhand data. Research is important. But when you've gone out and perhaps asked your own questionnaires, done your own surveys, or even held your own interviews or focus groups where you've spoken to real life customers, and not just asked them, do you think this is a good idea? Because if you ask someone that, most people will say yes, because no one wants to upset somebody. But actually to ask sort of more detailed questions that unpack, what exactly are they looking for? And it's really important actually not to ask leading questions, because sometimes you could get, for example, questionnaires that ask questions like, don't you think it would be a brilliant idea if someone produced, and then they list exactly what they're going to produce?
Yeah.
And that's not really a fair question. if you actually ask the question, what features are missing from current solutions that you wish existed? That's a far more open and honest question, and you're likely to get fairer answers and more useful answers, actually. So not only will it help you to potentially get through the endorsement process, but actually it's going to give you a much clearer idea of how to develop your product, your service, so that it really meets consumer needs. So I would say that level of real deep sort of market research involving real people and looking at the competition, that's so important, because otherwise, if you don't do that, all you've really got is an interesting idea and a hunch that people are going to like it. And that's not enough for us really to say that it is innovative, because you've not shown how other things lack what you've got, if that makes sense. But it also means that you haven't demonstrated that it's viable or scalable, because we've only got your word for it that there's demand for this.
Right.
Okay.
In terms of mentioning the innovativeness of an idea, as a founder or somebody who's applying on day one, do they have to start the innovation from the very first day, or is it something that they can show on their business plan that it comes about, say, in month 6 or month 24, or maybe it takes 2 years for them to introduce the innovativeness in the business?
That's a very good question. Again, it varies depending on the nature of the project. For example, some people, if they're transferring an existing, more or less, business idea from a different country, they may expect to be able to use the innovative element in that it's innovative in the UK right from the start. And often service-based businesses can do that more easily because the innovation is already defined, if that makes sense. But where it's a product that isn't as yet created, or some sort of algorithm or tech, there's normally a development timeline, which you're absolutely right, could be 3 months, could be 6, could be a year or more. The challenge then is we need to see that there is sufficient innovation in the project for it to justify doing well early on, if that makes sense. So in other words, so let me give an example. Let's say a company is creating an online platform. It could be in any sector, but in the time it's going to take them to produce that, they're just offering consultancy. Okay, now that's a good way to generate some money, obviously, while you're building a product, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if the length of time it took to build that platform was very long, say it was 2 years or so, it would be really questionable how much actual innovation there is in that business overall, because for the first 2 years of running it, it's not really innovative, it's just doing something that already exists here. So we'd have to really question whether that was adding value to the UK economy, and whether that's what was intended, from the visa route, really. So does that make sense? So it's fine. You can absolutely support the business in the early stages with additional revenue streams. That's a very practical and very sensible thing to do, particularly while you're building something. And it's also can be a way, by the way, particularly there with consultancy, can be a great way to get paid to do your market research, because you're going to learn more about exactly what your customers are after. So that's a useful byproduct. But I think there isn't a simple answer. I think one of the questions we ask is, how soon will the innovative element actually start to generate revenue? And I think if it's a distant promise and we can't see a plausible route to getting that innovation ready and ready to sell, that's likely to make us more concerned about endorsing. But we also know that it always takes time to create a product, particularly if it's tech based. So it's absolutely fine to have a development timeline in place. But I think we'd be a bit, not suspicious, we'd be concerned if that goes on for too long, because actually, we need to see progress on the way.
Right. And as you mentioned that if somebody is making a product or a service, then you need to make sure that it's not easily replicated, right? But then a lot of people or founders, if they are trying to solve a problem that already exists and is being solved, and they add a couple of more features to that solution, how does the applicant then justify to the endorsing body saying that, okay, this cannot be replicated with the big budget of that business that already exists? What can we do as founders then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And sometimes we're presented with something which basically does exist, but that somebody's come out with a more comprehensive version. Um, and it's a fine line, because sometimes a more comprehensive version actually does raise the value of the innovation overall. But other times it's essentially what someone else is doing, but with, for example, a community element or some online guidance, or these sort of useful extras, but they're not fundamentally changing the key outcome of the innovation, if that makes sense. So I think that's where, for it to be genuine innovation, it needs to make a substantial, valuable addition to what already exists. So that could be cheaper, faster, more efficient, better outcomes, whatever it is. But it can't really just be, I found something that does 5 things and I found an additional 6th thing to add to that, that doesn't really make it a sort of standout development, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And
so you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, because I do get these questions asked that, I'm planning to add these many features to this product, but then my instant reply would be, but this can be copied very easily, isn't it? But how far do you go then to differentiate yourself from something that already exists, and they have the budget to like instantly copy those features that you're coming up with or buy you out?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, okay. So that's also a danger, I suppose. Some people might actively want to be to be bought out at some point,
Yeah.
depending on the size of the company. But obviously, that's not the sort of underlying intention of the visa route. You're right. I think it has to be something. That's where the defensibility comes into it, really. The whole idea of there being barriers to replication. If what you're suggesting is relatively easy to do, then there's no real barrier to entry. Someone can just do it themselves. And particularly if you've got, better capitalized, more established companies that enjoy economies of scale. So, just because they're established and, they can get preferential rates with suppliers and whatever, they could probably easily outcompete you, because A, they can copy the simple thing you're doing. There's no inherent complexity. There's no way for you to prevent them doing that, really. So it's easy for them to do. You can't stop them doing it. And 3, they'll probably do it cheaper. And 4, because they've got a large established customer base, they'll enjoy network effects, have already been established. And so even if you got a little bit of initial traction and interest from some of their customers, when they see that, the brand they trust is now doing it as well, they're very likely to stick with them. So that's why this defensibility is so important. It's not just about, you being different. It's about you being able to protect whatever you come up with, because innovation that is not protectable, the only real advantage you've got is first mover, which is, you're the first person to do it. But again, if there are bigger companies that have more established customer networks and larger teams, and what you're doing is easy to copy, there's very little way to protect that business. So you're absolutely right. That's a key consideration.
Right. And are the endorsing bodies looking for specific sectors or specific types of businesses to endorse?
No, do you know, that always gets asked, and I can honestly say I've now assessed, I think, 350 different business applications, wow. And they are very wide-ranging. With them, we sort of look at many different types of businesses. There are probably a lot of, because of the nature of innovation, a lot of tech-based businesses, at least some sort of platform involved or an app. But that's not always the case. It can be an innovative approach to sort of bricks and mortar type business that can still work. So no, I can honestly say we've had the widest range of different things you can imagine. I think if it's a good idea and there's genuine innovation, and it's something that you've got an established demand for, and you've got a clear way to be able to scale it, I think we'd be interested in hearing. That's the approach. You'd be very surprised at the wide range of different topics and sectors that we've covered.
So AI is not the answer to get an endorsement.
No, and it's funny, isn't it? Because it's a difficult one, because of course AI is increasingly going to be almost ubiquitous. We'll see it everywhere, won't we? It's going to be part of everything we do.
Yeah.
But no, it isn't. And actually, nor is sort of sprinkling a little bit of AI or machine learning or tokenization or any other sort of buzzword type tech onto something where it doesn't really belong. We're not sort of, it's a bit like the community element. If a community element to something really adds value, or some online learning resources that support the purpose of the product, of course, no problem. But in themselves, that doesn't make it innovative. I think the use of AI or any technological process needs to add inherent value to the problem that's being solved, not be an additional thing that is sort of like a magic dust that's sprinkled on top, to make it more appealing. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And how new should the business be? Like, a lot of people have the doubt, should we register the company quickly? Should we start a website? Should we launch? How new should the business be in order to get an endorsement? How far should a founder go, basically?
It's very tricky, because of course there are some constraints in that certain things you can't actually do until the business is established, which depending on the structure of the business, and if you've got an investor, for example, at the start, you might not be able to start doing things until it's formally set up, and that could be post endorsement. So it is tricky. Okay, there's no straightforward answer there. What I would say is, if you just have an idea, and doesn't matter how good the idea, but you haven't really tested it in any way. Now, what do I mean by tested it? I suppose part of that is the market research. Part of that is, even the beginnings of testing a proof of concept, however that might look. For example, some people do a short marketing campaign on social media just to gauge what interest there is. So those sorts of things are really good, because they give us indicators that somebody is onto something. And equally, somebody might have a letter of intent if it's a B2B business, from another business, something that shows you've got some early interest is always going to be helpful. But there's no actual requirement to, set anything up, specifically have a website, anything like that. When you do apply, you get the opportunity now to include a 2-minute video, which can just be, and sometimes these are the best ones, just literally a headshot of the founder, a bit like today, just people just talking and explaining their idea. But sometimes we've had animated sequences, that explain the concept. But that can be helpful. But actually, the key thing really is for the business plan to speak for itself. But of course, any early traction you've managed to obtain, if you've even, perhaps it's a new process for something, you've tested it and you've got some early results, that kind of thing can be included. But there's no requirement to, no. And we understand that in many cases, you might have early test results in a different environment. You might have, some sort of product schematics maybe, or, an outline of the tech stack you're going to use for a particular platform. And that's still some reassurance that you've thought through how this would work. So it could be a basic user experience, UX, UI sort of some mock-ups for that maybe, or some user flow processes, that kind of thing. So things that paint a picture and show us that you've already thought about this quite deeply, even though we know you've still got a development timeline. Okay, but we can see that you've already moved it forward, and that you've gone beyond just having a concept and an idea.
For somebody who's applying from the UK, they have access to people and their potential customers and businesses directly. But somebody applying from their home country, how do you recommend them to do that market research outside of the desk-based research?
And you're absolutely right, that is challenging. I suppose, the simple answer there is, if you're aiming to sell the product internationally, then there's no problem with you doing some of that research in your own country or elsewhere if you can.
Right.
If you're not able to do that, I suppose the only real option is to use sort of forums or Facebook groups or whatever to try and reach out and get some. And we do understand that it's easier for some people than others. And actually, from a graduate perspective, that is an advantage, isn't it, if someone's on a graduate visa, because they have got that potential. So make the most of that. But you're right. This is why we can never have absolute sort of, if you do this, you will succeed, or this will get you endorsed, because it's the combination of what somebody does given their circumstances to best prove that they've got something that's innovative, viable, and scalable. And I think if you have that in mind, that sort of guides you in how best to do it. But you have to be imaginative, and there are ways. We're in an international, sort of obviously very connected world, and it may not be as easy as for some, but you can still do it.
Yeah. You mentioned that you get a wide variety of businesses applying. Would you mention something outside of tech that eventually received an endorsement without revealing any confidential details?
I think, often there is a tech element. I'd say that overwhelmingly there is, because innovation lends itself to that. But whereas a lot of them are what I would call tech first, in that they're a platform that solves a problem, or an educational resource, or those sorts of things, sometimes they are literally real world items that someone has created a better version of. So, and they could be, I can't really say specific things because, at this stage, but I'll give you an example. There might be an item of clothing that I'm thinking of one particular one here. Items of clothing that respond particularly well in certain environmental conditions, for example. So, and just to be clear, in that particular case, that's around withstanding heat. Other things already exist, but it did it in a much better way, in a much more efficient way and sustainable way. So, those are the kind of ideas. But there are real world, items that people use. But when I say there's generally a tech element, I suppose what I mean is, even with those, that's someone still had to have a sort of scientific process and a technical design to be able to create it. So to some extent, innovation is I wouldn't say always, but is usually tech-based to some extent, in that it's very hard in this world, after business has been going for so long, to come up with a genuinely new, not impossible, but genuinely new idea that wasn't based on taking something that exists in some form and improving it through the application of technology. I think that's often the case. So, that's a good example I can think of. But certainly things like, specific types of food and drink for types of individuals with needs. Sports people, for example. But again, there's a tech element in the formulation, the science behind that. But all sorts. It isn't always just a platform, although a lot of those do come our way.
I'm sure that'll be relieving to a lot of aspiring founders now, because everybody's just so obsessed with tech. Of course, it has to be added in some way or the other to scale the business eventually. But then just to be obsessed with the idea of including tech into anything and everything without knowing where the right use is, I think that's the kind of mistake a lot of people are making at the moment.
I think I've just thought of another one that typically
Yeah.
comes up, but again, without giving the specific example, often someone will have a service-based business that where they've just come up with a new process, and it could be a new way of thinking about a particular challenge. So I'm thinking of a sort of a consultancy model or that sort of thing, where someone's got a brand new approach to supporting people in a certain industry.
Yeah.
And so their intellectual property, their innovation, is in how they structure that idea and how they present their thinking. Um, and that's tricky because obviously what we have to see is that this isn't just another consultancy. It has to have something that nobody else has got. And of course, the difficulty there is how protectable is that, because someone could take that idea and use it. However, there are people, because of their own experience and their own credibility, and just how they've set up the business model, they're still able to do it in an innovative way that works for them. So that doesn't really involve tech at all. I mean, often they do. At the very least, we'll use things like we are today, Zoom and the CRMs and whatever. But not really. It isn't really about the tech. It's about the approach to solving an existing problem there. So it should reassure people. Honestly, you can go
Yes.
for
Yeah.
anything. You really can.
Based on this, would you say that if a founder is trying to integrate different technologies that exist and their approach is innovative, would that qualify in a way? For
So
example,
give me
you
an
spoke
example.
about the consulting experience. So if as a founder, somebody is doing consulting in a particular field and they're integrating different kinds of technologies and not really creating something new, but their approach to this consulting is different as compared to someone else, does that in any way qualify because of their
It,
experience and what they've done?
it's tricky because I think we'd probably, so for example, if somebody just came along with a leadership consultancy and said, I don't know, I mean, everyone uses Zoom, but if they came up with, say, another type of conferencing system that was available and that had more advantages that already exist, that wasn't theirs, and they said, I'm going to be a leadership consultant, but use this different software package, that wouldn't be innovative because all you're
Yeah.
really doing, So I suppose what I'm saying is that's another really crucial point, is there's got to be something about the founder and the innovator themselves that they bring to this project that makes it right that they're the person who leads it. What we sometimes get is somebody who's perhaps got a reasonable idea, perhaps they've even got the money, the resources, and a team to do the work, but they themselves don't have any sector experience in that area. They're not going to create the actual innovation themselves. And it's really hard to see, why are they leading it? Does that make sense? So in
Yeah.
other words, what value are they bringing to this other than they can afford to outsource the creation of something
Yeah.
and they've got an idea, so there needs to be a sort of a coherence between who's doing it and what they're creating. Now, it doesn't mean always that you need to be a technical person, because you might have sector knowledge. For example, someone might come to us with many years experience in human resources. That's what they've always done. And so they've got an idea for an HR platform that supports companies to manage their human resources in a brand new way that's not currently done. We wouldn't turn that down just because they're not a software engineer, because they have got very deep sector knowledge. They understand exactly what HR managers are looking for. So that's a really important thing.
Right.
Obviously, and equally, if somebody didn't have sector knowledge, but they were a software engineer or a developer, we'd consider that as well. So, but there has to be some element of what you're doing that is aligned with the project, that proves that you're the right person to be doing it. Otherwise, it just feels like you've come up with an idea and you've got the resources and you're just going to do something, but it doesn't really need you. The innovation has to come from the founder, if that makes sense.
Right.
So that's important. Yeah.
Which brings me to the next question. Can a non-tech founder pitch a tech business?
Yes.
And if yes, if he or she is a sole founder, then how much of the tech can they outsource? Can the innovativeness of the business be outsourced as well?
That is a difficult one. Obviously, in an ideal situation, because people will. I mean, we've already established that a large number of projects have a technical element because nature of innovation. Okay,
Yeah.
so we do know that not everyone will have a tech background, but I think, as I said, if someone's got a very strong sector experience, so say this new platform is the NHS and they've been a doctor for 20 years or whatever, that would be, they'd have that credibility. The difficulty comes in when you outsource everything. How much of the actual innovation is down to the founder? Okay, now you could say they came up with the idea and the concept, but I think what really reassures us is either that, and I get it, people can't afford, particularly if they're bootstrapping something, to start with a large development team. That's often the case, and so makes economic sense and it's very pragmatic to outsource things. But the question is, who within the founding team has the technical knowledge to genuinely oversee what is being created?
Yeah.
Because if the whole technical leadership has been outsourced, it's questionable with someone who has no technical understanding at all, whether they're really in control of what's being produced and whether they're really responsible for the innovation. Often what we see is sometimes people have, even if they don't have a chief technical officer, appointed as part of the founding team, perhaps it is just a sole founder, but often there's some form of advisory board or somebody who's giving a steer. Incidentally, it can help us to determine the credibility of the plan if you indicate in your business plan if you've had that technical support in coming up with the ideas, because particularly when somebody clearly doesn't have a tech background and yet they're freely saying, my new platform will do this, this, and this is how the tech will work. We want to know, well, how did you determine that?
Yeah.
How have you come up with that credible plan, if you like? How can we be sure it's likely? Again, there's no exact answer, but no, we've definitely endorsed projects where people aren't, tech individuals at all, and arguably, as long as you've got a way to cover the technical element, that is perhaps less important than the real knowledge of the problem that you're seeking to solve and understanding the needs of the market, because before you can create an innovation, you've got to come up with something that fits what is required and that actually solves a problem that only someone who understands the sector would be able to do anyway. So,
Yeah.
that's why sometimes, we get the opposite where someone is perhaps very tech based in their background and they've chosen a sector they want to go into, but this sector is perhaps quite sensitive or highly regulated. Health would be a good example. And they're coming up with all these things they're going to do, but they haven't demonstrated in the plan that they understand the regulatory frameworks they'll be working under, or that they really get how things work in that sector. It's not just, creating innovation is not just a technical exercise. There's a lot of sector specific knowledge and subtlety and sort of understanding that you need to show in there. So in some ways, it makes it easier for the sector expert to be the innovator than the tech expert. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's a very useful point you mentioned where you said that you have a lot of tech going on in the business, but then who is actually overseeing that tech if you don't have the experience or the skills for it?
Absolutely.
So I think that's very, very useful. But would you then say that having mentors or an advisory board or somebody on the outside who's also mentioned on the business plan can be useful if you don't have that tech background or the sector knowledge?
Absolutely. And often, this is a good example for graduates. Often, uh, the better graduate applications will leverage, connections people have made at university, whether that be in an enterprise team, as some people were there as they don't have to be salaried, but they can be there
Yeah.
as an advisory board, or if somebody has, perhaps a scientific background, they can even refer to leading experts who come from the university where they studied, but in that area as an advisor. So all of that can help, absolutely. It's anything that shows that you're not totally alone, that you've built yourself a little network, and that, even though you want to be the person who's driving this forward and you'll take full responsibility, that you're surrounding yourself with the right people, to help you.
Right.
Yeah.
Coming to graduates, just out of curiosity, are there a lot of graduates now applying for the Innovator Founder route?
Yeah, it's a real mix. I have to say, there's a complete mix. There certainly are. I've recently been writing some case studies of some of our really successful, people who've gone through and achieved indefinite leave to remain. And there's a real mix. Some people are very seasoned, long-term business people who have had successful businesses in their own country and have come here, and then maybe in their 50s, and
wow.
And you get that, but also you get a lot of people who literally have graduated, and have decided they want to stay. So it's been a seamless transition in some ways for them. But others who perhaps graduated not too long ago and then have gone home and then subsequently applied and come back with an idea. So any of those models work. There's a real mix. I would also say the government's recent white paper makes it clear that they really value and really want to promote the transition from graduate visa to Innovator Founder, because they see that as the kind of natural step, which makes absolute sense. And it's something we're working on, Innovator International, to try and find routes to make that easier, really, because it's an obvious, move to make, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely.
Now, as a graduate entrepreneur, I absolutely understand the importance of having that platform for graduates to, jump into entrepreneurship. But what would you recommend or advise to students who finish uni and then go on the graduate route? So they've got about 18 to 24 months now. What can they do during that time instead of instantly applying and be ready to apply for an endorsement after, say, 18, 20 months?
I think it's a great question. For me, it's a lot of the things we've already talked about. There are some obvious things. If you can get any sort of entrepreneurial experience or connections, then do that. Even if you've got the sort of the time and finances permit to volunteer to support others, because even sharing that you've got recent involvement with other endeavours that may not be directly relevant to what you're doing, but in a sense, it's kind of really good experience, and it shows that you're someone who puts themselves out there. So that can be useful. But also, I think, as we said, there's no reason why during that time you can't be looking at market research, and particularly if you're in the UK, direct customer research. Going to them and getting a sense of what would really work, and potentially even beginning to. I don't mean create a full MVP or anything, depending on what you're doing, but certainly, mapping out some plans, testing out some basic ideas, doing some, like I said earlier, a few people have included sort of hard data from basic social media ad testing. Don't need to spend a lot, but just run a short campaign over a few weeks to see what the likely interest, or even with Facebook groups or whatever, to find out the likely level of interest. But anything where you can show, I suppose what you've got is you've got time to actually pull together as much background research and to show that you've already moved things forward as far as you're able to currently, because I appreciate you might have other considerations like paying your rent and all of that sort of stuff. But as far as possible, just demonstrating that you've been exploring ideas and that you've finally come up with something which you think is the right thing to do, and you're well prepared for this, that you put in place a lot of good things, that would really help.
And for somebody who's not on the graduate route and they've done their bachelor's, their master's, and just right out of uni, they want to apply for the Innovator Founder now, how can they leverage their university time or their dissertation work or any kind of essay work that they've done to be qualifying for the endorsement? Is there a way?
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, they can, yeah. If particularly if the project that they are applying for is directly relevant to their graduate or postgraduate work,
Yeah.
yeah, then do absolutely. We regularly get applications where the entire idea for the innovation came from somebody's master's research or post or even their sort of final dissertation as a undergraduate, whatever it might be. They often come from those sorts of routes. It could just arise from something interesting that you found in your research. And again, that makes an interesting story for us because you're not somebody who's just thought of an idea. This has arisen from something you're already interested in, you've already studied. So that instantly gives a bit more credibility. It doesn't have to be from that, but we can see a natural route for someone coming up with that idea. So yeah, by all means, do
Yeah.
that.
And what about the success rate? A lot of people ask this question: what's the success rate of an endorsement? And is it different for graduate entrepreneurs as compared to an experienced entrepreneur?
Okay. In terms of people applying and then getting endorsed, it's been pretty even. I don't think it's changed a huge amount. It's certainly in the last sort of 18 months or so. I think it's around, roughly speaking, it's around 20% of applicants are endorsed. Okay.
Right.
I think in terms of long-term success, particularly people who were on the startup, there was a higher level of dropout on that route. So that probably would skew the success a little bit. And also, you've got to think, I painted a picture of some very well established business people who maybe in their 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s have, large, in some cases, seven-figure businesses abroad who are taking a new innovative idea and bringing it to the UK. You'd expect them to have a higher success level anyway, because of they've got a lot more to leverage there, and so that would skew the data anyway. So of course, it would be less successful overall because if you look at particularly looking at the startup rate. I can also say, without a shadow of a doubt, there are people that who have come as graduates, even people whose initial business plan I assessed only 18 months ago, who are already, you would say, an established successful business. So there's no reason why it can't do that. I think you just have to be realistic that, business is always going to be challenging. Startups, and to be honest, anyone who starts their own business, I think it's a brave thing to do. It has amazing potential for your life. And if it comes off, what a great thing. But to do that on top of being in a new country, if you're a graduate, you've got to know that country already. So, but even so, it's still a huge thing to do away from your family, perhaps. And, there's all of that. But look, people succeed. That's the thing they really do. And yeah, that's the thing to think. There's no real reason other than experience why the sort of success, long-term success proportion would be lower. I think because the people that we get who are graduates are hugely enthusiastic, very, very capable, and have some brilliant ideas. So I don't think it makes a huge difference.
Right. From your experience, do you think entrepreneurship is for everyone?
Oh, that's a great question, isn't it? Do you know, I think everyone to some extent has an entrepreneurial sort of spirit. I think it's in us. I think, but I do think there are some people who just, for whatever reason, they thrive better in a sort of predictable, job-based career environment with clear progression, and no risk. And I think that's probably true. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there are certainly people who don't, they are good at analysing risk, and that's a key thing, by the way, to put in your business plan. Make sure there's a lot of thought given to managing risk. But I think there's a lot of people who are entrepreneurs. They don't just think, oh, what if this happens? What if that happens? Looking at the bad, potential bad things, which you do need to do. But they also ask themselves, but what if it works? And that's the thing, having that sort of positive outlook but also trying to minimize risk as much as possible at the same time. But yeah, I think you're right. There probably are people who have that drive more than others. And also the determination just to change the world in their own little way, whatever that might be, to make a difference, to think innovators generally are the kind of people who just get frustrated by seeing things that don't work as they should,
Yeah.
and I think that's great. Yeah, so there probably is a real sort of sense of that in a lot of people who apply for the route.
So what can an applicant, a founder, do apart from all of this to stand out in their application when they're applying for an endorsement? Is there like an X factor that the endorsing body is looking for in the founder?
Yeah, do you know, it's and I think sometimes, I mean, I wouldn't say it's something we necessarily look for because it would be very hard to define. But I think sometimes when there's a real match between who the founder is, as in their personality, that really comes across, their experience, the idea, and the plan. When those four things align, if you like, you get a real sense of something being authentic and like it has a sort of coherence about it where you think, yeah, I can see this. I can see why this person, why this plan, why now, and exactly what they're trying to do. And it just all comes together. And I think, yeah, that does happen. And I can't possibly say what you need to do that. That's the honest answer. But I would say, don't be afraid to be authentic in your application. By all means, be professional, of course, but actually show some personality. It's okay to have a founder story where the idea arose from something you experienced. That gives it a real life sort of credibility as well. I mean, obviously, it's still got to be a great idea. You've got to have a good plan, but don't be afraid to show some personality. And I think if you get to we haven't talked about the process yet, but if you got to the interview stage, not everyone, not everyone has an interview, but sometimes we do need to interview applicants. That's a good opportunity to truly be yourself, and actually, just explain and be honest and say why you're excited by it. Because while on the one hand it is a formal, logical approval process, actually there's a human element to this. There is something around the motivation and the drive and the personality of the founder that is important. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's an idea and a person who we believe is capable of seeing this through. So, yeah.
Right. And what are some of the most common mistake you've seen founders making during the application process?
Okay, I would say lack of proper research is the big one, because no matter how good an idea sounds, if you really haven't tested it, at least to some extent. Now, we understand that as part of your MVP development, you might want further rounds of deep, questionnaires and focus groups and all that, and that would happen as you build it, of course. But to come along without really having asked anybody, is this a good idea? What would you like? I think that's a big one. I think having a disconnect between who you are and what you're trying to do, that's always really clear. When someone's come up with a good idea, but you really question, well, yeah, it might be a good idea, but actually, why are you the right person to do this? So, does it align carefully with your skills, experience, backgrounds? That's another one. Having sufficient resources, that could be finances. Now, there isn't a set amount. There used to be a sort of a £50,000 figure, but that's not the case. And so it is what is required to do the job. And in some cases, for some businesses, particularly a service-based one, there might be very low startup costs. Okay, but on the flip side of that is sometimes we've had incredibly complex technical development projects involving AI, blockchain, several different Internet of Things, everything, and someone's got £500 to build this. That's not credible. And I think so. Obviously, financial projections that are as realistic as they can be. I think a lot of people sometimes over predict their revenue, and that can affect the credibility of the plan. You know, if someone's suggesting that they've got, I don't know, a couple of £1,000 to invest in the project, and that by the end of year one it's going to be, you know, earning 20 million revenue, we sort of, well, hold on, how's that going to happen? So, you know, obviously we want people to be ambitious. We're not trying to stop that, but also realistic. So, and we do understand that in the first year, especially, that you might make an in-year loss, and so obviously having some money to cover that is key. We can't endorse, something where it's clearly going to lose money and there's no contingency there to cover that. It's okay to want to plan future rounds of seed funding, for example, but don't let your business solely rely on that, unless you've got, you know, already sort of real traction and indicators you're highly likely to get that money. Because otherwise it just makes us think, well, what if you don't get that funding? How are you going to keep the business going? So it's got to, I suppose the key things in the early stage, have you got the right people and resources and money in place? And can you withstand any challenges? What are your contingency plans? What happens if you don't develop the MVP when you think? Will you run out of money? So things like cash flow, scenario planning, those sorts of things, that can really help as well. It's just really show that you've thought through all the things that could go well, but also the things that might not go well, and that you've got a plan in case. That's really what we're looking for.
Right.
So those are probably the biggest errors, I think, on the whole.
Yeah. Right. Coming to the same business extensions, people who have been on the Innovator visa and now switching or wanting to switch or extend their visas to the Innovator Founder, are there a lot of founders left having the Innovator visas now planning to switch, or what's the situation like right now?
Yeah, well, there's, a lot of people I know have felt sort of left in the lurch, with other endorsing bodies sort of stopping, and but the other thing to sort of reaffirm is that you're able to choose another endorsing body, so you're very welcome to come to Innovator International, and your existing visa support would continue with no additional costs. So just to make sure people are aware of that, except obviously when you get to your next progress review or anything you'd normally pay money for. So, and that's obvious really. But the key thing is just keep business going, and try not to worry. I mean, obviously it's always frustrating when you build a relationship with perhaps a team and a mentor and that falls through. But I think it's fair to say that, the three endorsing bodies are all able to do that. And, we'd be very happy if anyone wanted to contact us if they're in that position and ask for guidance. And if we can step in, then that's fine. But it's been reasonably smooth, I would say. It's not been that difficult. And people have got what they needed in the end, which, it's hard. It is hard because I know on a human level, it's whether people are applying right at the outset or people are even going for indefinite leave to remain. So I get to do all the assessments through that process. And wherever people are, any kind of application is always a stressful time because you've got so much invested in it. You want it to work, but we're very happy to listen and help wherever we can. That's all I can say with that.
So what does a founder need to submit apart from their progress report? What is the endorsing body looking for anyone wanting to switch or extend their Innovator visas now?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We do get a lot that, they might get to the progress stage, and even though you want to be able to sort of go for indefinite leave to remain, you're just not at that point. Yeah. So, and we understand that. We also know that people won't necessarily reach their revenue projections. So I think what we would always say is be really honest with us in the progress report you submit. It's a lot easier actually if you've had mentor support, because they will help with presenting that in an appropriate way. But I think sometimes people think, I won't tell them this because that will stop them, sort of re-endorsing me. But actually, we're more likely to not endorse if we feel we're not being given the full picture. But just to reassure everyone, I think as long as there's a good reason behind the progress you've made and you are actually making progress, particularly, against the original plan, then obviously we look at that in a favourable light. So, you might not say you've anticipated making 30,000 in the first year. Well, if you fell short of that, but you still made some decent money, I think we'd understand that. Obviously, the further you go on, and if you're aiming for indefinite leave to remain, we've got to have genuine evidence of this being a sustainable and scalable business that, can stand on its own 2 feet. And you've got to meet those settlement targets, at least 2 of those. So, we need to sort of satisfy ourselves that you are at each stage, you're genuinely making progress. We know that things go wrong. We know that MVPs take twice as long as you thought. We know that it's hard to break into a new market and you didn't realise something, or that a pivot was necessary. But obviously, always get that agreed by your endorsing body. Don't just go off and do totally different things. But yeah, we understand, and I think on the whole, I think we have a fair and transparent process. But when it comes to the progress review, I think as long as people have demonstrated that they've made progress against their endorsed plan, and that there's some way close to the sort of big picture, revenue targets, that sort of thing, or at least heading that way, I think, you'll be in a reasonable position. That's what I would say. And it's also okay to modify your plan. So when you get to a progress review and actually you think, well, perhaps those revenue targets were a bit high, with discussion, it's okay to review your plan going forward to make it more realistic with where you are now, and that's okay. But again, it's just an open discussion really that leads to that.
Right. And given that most former businesses that were endorsed on the Innovator visa, they came out during the post-COVID era. So is there any consideration or any flexibility given to those businesses, keeping in mind that they were literally just emerging after the COVID, and they faced a lot of different kinds of challenges as compared to a founder being endorsed today?
Yeah, 100%. We, that is part of it. And so when we ask for a progress report, that's exactly the kind of contextual knowledge that we need to have shared with us, and you're right, of course, particularly if somebody had let's say it was a service-based business that is face-to-face, when you weren't allowed to meet people, for example, yeah, of course, and we know that there was a mass scramble to do everything online, and that's probably sped up a lot of innovation in many ways. But nonetheless, yeah, we are mindful of that. We do understand. I suppose what we'd like to see where that has happened is that in the time since the sort of post-COVID recovery has begun, that we can at least see the seeds of rapid progress and getting back on track. That's the thing. But yeah, it's understood that. I mean, that was a once in a century experience, hopefully for all of us.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
Addressing the elephant in the room, and something that you've touched upon previously as well, funding.
Yes.
So, what is the endorsing body looking for when it comes to funding and financial forecast in the business plan?
Okay. Well, with funding, I think the key thing is because of obviously government money laundering regulations and so on, we need to know where the money is coming from, and the source of it, and have sort of proof of funds. And when you get to that point of the application, you'll see, if you go on our website, I think one of our real strengths is that we actually do have a significant amount of information available to talk you through the application process. And for example, you'd easily be able to show the money leaving whichever account coming into your business account. So as long as we've got that trail and we know why it's there. And of course, if you do have an external third-party investor or business partner, we need to know the agreements that are in place in terms of equity, and have you got a shareholder agreement? And it's key to us, obviously, that anyone applying is a person of significant control in their business. In other words, not somebody who's got 2% of another person's business and it's not theirs. So that's all obvious, really. So that's the sort of compliance side of it. But in terms of financial projections, it's really about it just being as detailed as possible. But also, we do know things change. We know that all financial estimates, particularly over 3 years for a startup, are at best broad estimates. So we do know that, but they need to be plausible. And sometimes people will make what are quite clear errors if you thought about it in advance. So, for example, sometimes people could say, well, in the first year, I'm going to employ 4 people. And yet when you look down through all the costs, there's nothing there for salaries. And the business is only planning to generate 20,000. And you've not got the money available as an initial investment to cover that. So straight away we think, well, that's not plausible. You're not covering the costs. One part of your plan is contradicting another. So just be clear that everything is coherent and consistent between one section and another. That's key. I think try and break down the costs as much as possible. And if you can sort of work out some, sort of key calculations like the cost to acquire a customer or their potential lifetime value. If you're having a subscription, the likely churn rate, how many subscribers will you lose each month, that sort of thing. And just provide as much of a breakdown as the startup costs that you expect to incur. And just, that's it really. And obviously indicate that you've got the cash flow and the runway available to sort of manage certainly the first year, that you're comfortable there. And contingency, if it is possible, is always a good thing to have some money set aside just in case. But those would be the main things, I think.
And how does a founder decide how much initial funding should they show for endorsement? So, for example, we're aware that £50,000 requirement is no more there; it's been scrapped. But as a founder, how do I know if £5,000 for the first 12 months is enough, or if showing more amount means higher chances of endorsement?
The money that's in the project does need to be there for a reason. We don't just want someone to say, I've got £500,000, let me in. It's not about that.
Yeah.
It needs to be a suitable amount for the project in hand. I suppose that the best advice I can give is to research carefully the likely costs, particularly if you're not that familiar with the UK and therefore you haven't researched, let's say, the costs of renting an office in London, for example, and you put in a very small amount. That again will undermine the credibility. So do your research. Come up with credible amounts for each of the things you're going to cover. And ultimately, if you can, have some contingency, but don't feel you have to have enormous amounts. It depends on the project. The key guideline really is, have you set out in as much detail as possible what you're going to spend, what you're likely to get in and when in terms of revenue, and have you got enough money to get this developed with a little bit more to make sure that you can withstand any delays and that you've got a credible path to building a viable business that's going to give you some profit and cover your costs. That's it's no more complex than that. Right. But it comes down to just checking details, running the numbers, providing some scenario plans. Options are good, where you look best case, worst case, most likely case, that kind of thing. That can help us to gauge how well you know your business and the likelihood of success.
And do you get a lot of business plans where founders say they're going to be bootstrapping the business?
It's a mix, and it's completely understandable where, because personal circumstances, people don't always have, significant amounts of money available. So of course we do. I think then our question is, have you genuinely got enough to create the thing, whether that be a business, a service or a product? And also the big question is, how are you going to be self-sufficient financially? We've had applicants ask if it's okay to have an additional source of income. So maybe they've got a part-time job. I think what we're really concerned about is somebody who perhaps has a full-time job in the UK and is going to do this on the side, because actually that's not really consistent with creating a genuinely innovative, scalable business. It's more of a side hustle. So, it's not that there's a bar against earning money elsewhere, particularly, as I said earlier, in terms of consultancy opportunities with your business, if that's available. But what we can't have is someone basically having a career and then doing this, as a sort of side project. So that's key.
So because the Home Office has said that people can work full time, and if founders want to work full time but also want to build the business, does that count as something not very appropriate by the endorsing body? Because a lot of founders do wonder if they can, for example, work full time and then inject some of that income into their business, but also have some initial capital, like say 10 to 20,000 pounds to start the business. Does that look like something that they want to do on the side and they're not too serious about it?
It is hard. I mean, I think we need to see. It does look like that, to be honest. It looks like, and of course, we want to see someone who's fully committed to the project that they're doing. Now, we also know that particularly in the early stages of a business, someone might not have anything that they can sell, while it's being developed. So there's no hard and fast rules, but I think if we felt that someone didn't have enough bandwidth to actually get a business up and running because they were totally committed to doing something else, that would undermine the credibility of the plan. So, it's ultimately we're looking for people who are fully committed to this. This is their main thing, but we understand that they also need to keep living while they're doing that. So, it's the sort of thing that we often explore at interview, for example. How does that look in practice? And that's fair enough, I think.
And does that work in a scenario where they justify it by saying that they want to build contacts or they're working in the startup space to gain more skills and experience in the similar industry where they're building their product or service?
Yeah, I think we'd be more inclined to understand that, because arguably they're being paid to do their research. So there are, we're flexible. We do understand, but I think the key message here is that ideally, particularly once you're selling something, that actually your full focus is on what you're doing. And what I suppose the opposite way of putting it is, what we couldn't have is somebody who, or this would be very unlikely to be endorsed, if somebody said, I'm going to create a platform that does this, it'll be ready in 3 years, and in the meantime I'm going to carry on doing the job I'm doing at the moment, because that clearly is kind of a way to extend their time in the country without credible progress towards creating something that is innovative. So I've given a sort of an extreme example, but I think where things are in the middle, obviously there's some discussion to be had. But I think the greater the relevance of the work, particularly if it's consultancy under that business, in the short term, that's fine, I think, on the whole, particularly if we can see progress towards making the innovative thing. But it's when it's completely unrelated career going on alongside, and we're not seeing progress on the innovative item, that doesn't look good. Yeah.
Right. So, for example, if somebody has a very innovative idea and there's an investor who's really interested to invest into their business, before endorsement, do they need to have the investment funds into their bank account, or a letter of intent works? And what kind of documents eventually work if they have to prove that they have the funds required and there's an investor interested to invest in their business?
Really good question. You don't have to have it when you apply. Often the investors will provide a letter of intent that says, subject to endorsement and the company being established under UK law, then the investment will be made. Sometimes there's staged payments. So that's all okay. Obviously, a letter of intent is key if you're relying on that investment income. So in other words, if you don't have your own funding. And then, similar to the sort of money laundering principles, we want to know the source of that income and seeing it arrive, into the account or whatever, if it's already been provided. So it's very similar principles to your own personal funding, really. It's all about why, and who's paying for it and why. Obviously, if they're also applying under the same visa route, they would have a completely separate application, a separate interview. That's a requirement. And we need to ensure that they are fundamental to the success of the business and they've been involved from the outset. So those are sort of key things there. But really, we rely on, if there is some sort of shareholder agreement and decision-making framework so that we know, whatever investors there are, sometimes there are many, there could be many small investors in a larger project. There could be multiple founders. But we need to see that each person who actually applies under this visa route has, significant control of their business, that they're somebody who can genuinely actually decide the strategic direction of the business. Because if they can't, that it would be inappropriate for them to apply. So those are the key things.
Right. And apart from a letter of intent, for example, if a founder has money in someone else's bank accounts, parents, relatives who are planning to invest money, what proof do they show? Is it bank statements or
yeah, absolutely the same? Yeah, bank statements. It can be a letter from a family member saying I'm, ready to invest this amount, but we'd still need to see the bank statement. Absolutely.
Right.
Just so that we're clear, it's always two things. One, it's about the viability. So if you're saying you've got this money, we need to see that's true. So that's number one. But secondly, we need to, from a money laundering perspective, check that, this is coming from a legitimate source and that, what the basis behind that is really. So.
And out of curiosity, have you had businesses saying that they just have £10,000 and they're still endorsed? Or
when it comes to the amount, as I said, I wouldn't want to give a minimum because I don't think that's appropriate. Because actually, sometimes, as I said, if it's a service-based business that is innovative in the UK but say already exists abroad, actually there's no real costs. Other, you know what I mean? So it could be really minimal. But it's all about, is it appropriate to the the kind of plan really, and what you're undertaking? Is the initial amount going to enable you to develop what you're trying to do and stay in business? That's really all it comes down to.
Right. Timeline-wise, what is the right time to apply for endorsement? And if somebody's visa is expiring, say, in the next 30 days, can they still apply for an endorsement?
We don't technically have a sort of fast track process, but I can tell you if absolutely, if you do apply, and there is a bit of a timeline here, and you've got a visa expiring, just let us know when you do that, and we do our very best to obviously prioritise that application because it makes sense. The best time is when you feel ready to do it, to be in all honesty. I mean, there's never a perfect time in that you're balancing a lot of things. You're balancing your own life requirements. You're also balancing, on the one hand, being sufficiently detailed in your plans and having thought it through that you're going to appear credible to us. But also, if you leave it too long, it's an innovation. Someone else could come along and do it before you. So we get that. I think the danger is to be underprepared and not to have done some of the things we've already discussed. So I think to put in at least enough thought into your business plan, your proposal, and your financial projections and your research. I think if you've done those things, you're ready to go. And, we know it won't be perfect, but as long as we can see, you've really thought this through, that instantly helps it be taken more seriously, obviously.
So people on visas, would you say anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks is a good time?
I think so. Ideally, absolutely. Right. I mean, again, if you are leaving it late, do still, we will still do it. Obviously not the day before.
Right, yes.
But, because in terms of timelines, we try to sort of turn them around approximately within 4 weeks. But as I said, if it is a little less than that, we can speed things up.
So what happens after the endorsement? There's a lot of information. Thanks to Innovator International, there's ample information available before the endorsement process. But what happens after somebody has submitted their business plan and paid the assessment fee? Is there an interview? Does everybody have to go through the interview? And what really happens in that interview? Because everyone's really stressed about that part as well.
That's understandable. Yeah, no, not everybody has to have an interview. Essentially, what happens is it's assigned to an assessor, so somebody like me, and we all typically have certain sort of sectors and areas where we're experienced, and that's what we tend to do. And that assessor obviously will have a workload of many different ones on the go, but on the whole, as I said, we'll turn those around within by a month, within a month. But what happens is the assessor will look through everything you've submitted, so mainly the business plan, but any supporting documentation you might have included with that. So it could be your financial spreadsheets and letters of intent, those sorts of things, anything you think is relevant. And we'll do a preliminary assessment of that, and then determine whether or not we need to have an interview straight away. So may not need to have one. But at the interview, they're usually about 30 minutes long, and they're typically designed just to go over some of the details in in sort of more detail, really, just to check that we've got a really clear understanding of how your business is going to operate. It may be that we ask some questions prior to interview by email. That's very often the case. Again, not always. Sometimes the business plan tells us everything we need to know, so that's the case. So sometimes before interview, we'll email some questions and you can respond and answer them. If we get to the interview, it's usually the similar sort of process. So it'll be some areas that we want to get a little bit clearer on. And just so that we're fully clear on exactly where you're going with the business and what the plan is. And then after that, normally it just takes, well, it can be a week or so. Occasionally it's a little longer if we've got other information we need to find from a third party. But we try and keep you updated. But typically speaking, after the interview, within a week, you will have an outcome sent to you, so you'll know what's happening. Obviously, if you're recommended for endorsement, then you'll have to go through the formal process of submitting that to the Home Office for that to be approved. Very occasionally, they'll come back and ask you a load of stuff then, and it's just how it goes. But that can happen. But that's pretty much the process. But typically, by that point, once you've been recommended for endorsement, it's extremely likely that it will happen. So,
And are there any common mistakes you've seen people make during the endorsement process, like in the business plan, or they miss out something, or the business plan is too long, anything like that?
I think the two biggest, you're absolutely right, are around length, really. It's either there's sort of a Goldilocks zone, and I'm reluctant to say the exact number of pages, but please, not something that's 5 pages long, because that's not going to, or 10 pages really, unless it's really clear and concise. But equally, sometimes we get, I think the longest I've read was 180 pages, and I'll be honest, a lot of that was very repetitive. It was saying the same things, but under a different subheading. Appreciate that sometimes you want to include quite detailed appendices, that's fine. But if the main actual business plan can be kept as concise as possible, but cover everything, that's the key. And I think we give pretty clear guidance actually in how to submit. So I don't want to contradict that, but there is a sort of Goldilocks zone of not too short, not too long, if you like. So if we can go for that, that'd be great.
Right, perfect. In a situation where an applicant gets rejected, can they reapply immediately? And if they reapply immediately, do they have to pay the assessment fee again?
That's a very good question. Well, the first thing is, if we let you know that you've been unsuccessful, you do have the right to a second assessment without having to pay. Okay, so that's the first thing. So, and that would involve, obviously it being reevaluated. Usually there's an opportunity for you to add some more information if there's something you perhaps missed or we didn't quite understand, which can happen.
Yeah.
So there is that opportunity, and that's fair enough. That ensures that that's the case. And we also have an appeal process as well, which is mainly about, did we follow the process correctly? Okay, that's what that's about. Now, after all of that, people can then, if they wanted to, pay again to apply for another assessment. We'd question whether it would be a sensible idea unless they'd substantially rewritten the plan based on the feedback. It's very rare that that happens, because I think unless usually it's clear that either they need to go off and do a lot more research, or they're some way off and instantly sort of saying, well, I've added this bit in, now can I apply again? So, but people do go away and rethink their plans, and maybe change them quite substantially, and then come back and then get endorsed. So it does happen. So,
right.
But just to be clear, within that second assessment and appeal is really based on whether we made a mistake with what you've already produced. We're not suddenly expecting you to send us loads of new material, because that should have been included at the outset. There can be a small amount of clarifying, and there's a form that we get you to explain. We give you the opportunity to point out what we've missed out, really, if you feel we've made a mistake, and that's fair enough. But yeah, we need it's not the time to start suddenly sending 500 supporting documents that you forgot to send the first time around. So
yeah. And what would the turnaround time be for that once the rejection is done and the form is sent out again?
It's similar to the initial. We do want to give it a good time. It's often a little bit quicker. Right. But yeah, we again, we want to genuinely assess it all based on the new information. So it's important that it's given the time it needs. So yeah.
Before I ask the final question, what kind of pre-endorsement support does Innovator International provide to applicants? Is there any?
Pre-endorsement.
Pre-endorsement.
But yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, look, if it's always tricky, because we cannot obviously coach people on individual applications. That would be wrong, because we're here to act, as a robust assessment system on behalf of the UK government. But if anyone has a specific question, they could always reach out to info@innovatorinternational.com, which is the sort of the usual mailbox. And if there's anything specific you wanted to ask, you could ask there. But if you go on our website, there is a huge amount of information about actually applying, the process of applying, what we're looking for. You'll also find many case studies of existing and previous members that have been successful. We've got some training materials, and you'll see videos about specific sectors. For example, we have a Thursday coffee morning sort of webinar where usually it's a discussion and some input on a particular sector, or so there's lots there. I think if you go there and have a look, there's a huge amount. And we also have a newsletter you can sign up for, which is useful as well, all on the website. You'll see it there. And then obviously once you're successful, we've got a number of additional things that we can provide, and we'd talk to you about all of that at that point. But there's mentoring, coaching support. We have expert and individual expert sessions on a particular area that you want to focus on. So there's lots of opportunities to get support as you go through.
And very quickly, what does the 12-month and 24-month checkpoint meeting entail?
It is essentially, it's really, you produce a progress report which tells us how you've done compared to what you planned. That's it. So you just give us that, you tell us what's gone well, what's been a challenge, what are you working on next. And it's great, because it gives you as an entrepreneur a chance to refocus on what's important at the moment, and get clear on where you're going. And there is an interview process as part of that as well, to check that everyone's clear on what they're doing, and where they're headed, and that's it really. So it's not dissimilar from the original sort of assessment process, but obviously it's based on how well you've done up till now.
And the final question, how do you see the Innovator Founder route evolving in the next few years, especially keeping in mind the immigration white paper that was announced a few months ago?
I think that's the key. We're currently working on some ways that we want to bring universities together. Because we think that universities are amazing places to learn about enterprise, and loads of graduates that would have come out and will have had some amazing tutors and some great opportunities. But often we feel that it's the nature of things that their universities are very much set up for that early stage startup sort of ideation, proof of concept. But because they don't always have the chance to work with their entrepreneurs over the longer period, they perhaps don't have that more scale up side of things. And so we're looking at ways in which we can work with different universities collaboratively as a sort of network, really, to try and share best practices across universities. I think HEI's universities can still be a little bit insular. It's not criticism, but everyone gets on with their own worlds and does different things. So I think we'd like to see that. The white paper made it really clear that a key driver for the government is finding seamless routes from people who've been here as graduates and then a graduate visa, but studied here, crucially, that they are then able to go on to build businesses in this country, because they're precisely the people the government wants here: young, innovative, typically, young, innovative and enthusiastic people who can make a difference to this country and make a real contribution to the economy. So, that is exciting, because I think there'll be more of, hopefully, this sort of, kind of interaction, and hope, just hand on heart, really hope this leads to an increased number of applications for our route. It'd be great if it does. So yeah, I hope it's, I just hope it goes from strength to strength. I don't think there's any danger of it not existing, because I just think it's got such value, and I think the government recognise it as well. There's so many successes, there really are. So yeah.
Thank you, Keith. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope so too, that after the immigration white paper, the government does come out with something for graduates, because there's so much potential out there in universities and such amazing ideas, and they just need a path to get to that stage. And I think there needs to be something in between, where there's the university and the endorsing bodies, but something that bridges that gap. And I'm glad that Innovator International is working towards that. So that's amazing.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking through all of this with you. It's I hope it's been of useful to people out there. And like I said, hopefully it leads to some more great applications coming. I look forward to reading them. So great stuff. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.